Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another wonderful Friday Ramblings. Now, what we're going to do here is something a little bit different. I've kind of done this once before, but it's going to work a little tighter this time. Previously we had discussed the Superman storyline from the early 90s, the death and return of Superman, and how it impacted the Green Lantern mythos, which led to the Kyle Rayner Lone Lantern era. And we did that over the course of 2 videos, discussing initially the death and return of Superman, and then the Kyle Rayner Lone Lantern era. Well, we're going to go back to DC, and back to that theme idea, but this time it's going to be something a little bit different. Instead of having one big event that leads to a status quo change that wasn't directly connected to the event, the next 2 parts of our ramblings here, or episodes, I should say, are going to be thematically linked, in that we're going to discuss 2 different Batman crossover events that were basically set up as a trilogy of storylines that, interestingly enough, told the same basic story, which is how the idea of Batman and Batman as a identity and a concept within the superhero community is related to the man underneath the suit, and more importantly, what Batman means to Gotham City. Now, this episode's going to focus on the first time that DC really pushed this storyline idea, and that is the KnightSaga. This was done as a trilogy of smaller stories known as Knight's Fall, Knight's Quest, and Knight's End. Thus, the entire thing is called the KnightSaga. And all of that, in turn, being plays on Batman's nickname of the Dark Knight, which is, as all things go, a good nickname, and it was something that caught people's attention. Now, the background of this is that at the time the Batman books were spread across Batman, Detective Comics, Shadow of the Bat, Legends of the Dark Knight. Now, the main 2 books were Batman and Detective Comics. Legends of the Dark Knight was done as an anthology-style story where stories would bounce up and down going up and down, the history of Batman himself, his timeline. It's like you might have an arc set in the present day, and then you can have an arc set, early in his career, and then you'll have like an arc somewhere around the middle, then it's back to the present. So it as a series was more of a free form. And Shadow of the Bat was just kind of like where they put some of the more experimental stories where it's like, well, yeah, it's a story worth publishing, but we're really not sure it's like going to be a major story that fans will really, get super excited about. So, we'll just kind of put it in Shadow of the Bat. Because that's what happens a lot of time when you have spin-off titles that are a little bit newer. So, the idea of all this is that, was that as one writer was leaving in 1991, this being Peter Milligan, who has done a lot of work for both Marvel and DC and a few indie companies over many years, suggested to Batman's head editor, Dennis O'Neil, may he rest in peace, a storyline that was originally intended to just be a short little, two-part storyline. Cute little short arc to kind of transition things. But Milligan didn't get a chance to write it before he left. Well, Dennis O'Neil looked at it, thought about it some more, and saw a potential to make this a much bigger storyline. And he subsequently brought this, Dennis O'Neil convened the writers for the different Batman books, had a little summit meeting, and they came up with the idea of Nightfall, which would be a storyline in which Batman was injured to the point that he had to retire as Batman and hand the suit off to somebody else. Specifically, somebody we had never seen before. Now, I know what you're saying, especially after I just name-dropped it a little bit earlier. A storyline in the mid-90s where a hero is taken out and somebody else has to attempt to fill the shoes? Doesn't this sound a lot like Death and Return of Superman? Yes, it does, and the stories came out kind of on top of each other. This led a lot of speculation because Death of Superman did start shortly before that. It led the Batman crew to want to do this storyline. This has been denied by both the Batman and Superman editors, as it simply took O'Neil and the writers a while to cement their idea and get it started. Part of this is because the foreshadowing of Nightfall involved introducing two characters that were key to the storyline, and that is Jean-Paul Valley, who would use the superhero identity of Azrael. I know, you're going, hey, that sounds a little biblical. Well, that's the point. Jean-Paul Valley was basically a warrior of the faith. Unfortunately, he was a highly intense, highly violent warrior who had suffered a little bit of brainwashing by the Holy Order that he was taking orders from. Yeah, Holy Order giving orders. Redundant language. So, yeah, when we say he's Holy Warrior, we're talking kind of like, the old school crusades where people cut bloody paths across all of Europe and the Middle East. Yeah. Not exactly the most loving, kind era of the church there. But, that's something for another more history-based episode. Now, the other important character who debuted in a mini-series of his own was Bane. Now, we all know, thanks to a couple different movie continuity appearances, and the fact that he has become a villain and occasional anti-hero that is used regularly throughout DC's history, that Bane is somebody significant. For those who are completely comics blind or simply have forgotten who Bane is in particular, the short version, he was born in a prison down in South America that was definitely not minimum security. Like, everybody in this prison was a horrible, horrible person. He grows up in this environment, himself becomes a little sociopathic and obsessed with the idea of being the best. A warrior king who sits atop a throne of beaten and broken enemies, because, in a prison system where basically most of the convicts were kept in line because they were afraid of each other, that kind of mindset's going to be taught to a child. Whoopsie! This got even worse when he became the main subject testing a new super steroid, commonly referred to as Venom. Thus, he was super strong and super durable. However, he was highly intelligent. He was not just a mindless brawler. So, Bane decides that he is going to claim Gotham City as his own, and specifically do so by, quote, breaking the bat. As he saw, not the mayor, not the police commissioner, which, thank God, because we all like James Gordon, but he ain't exactly going to be capable of slugging it out with somebody, you know, built like a tank. But the Bat, the man that most of the Gotham underworld fears. So Bane makes his way to Gotham and enacts a scheme to, over time, wear Batman out by breaking out pretty much every villain he had ever encountered in his career out of Arkham and sending them one at a time in very rapid order against Batman in a kind of running the gauntlet scenario. Now, this would not have been as bad, except, unfortunately, at the time, Batman was experiencing some mental burnout and was not 100% confident in his partnership with current Robin, Tim Drake. And with the original Robin, Dick Grayson, who had long since adopted the secret identity of Nightwing, busy with the Titans, he was not in town to keep an eye on Bruce either. All of this builds to a head over a storyline that encompassed around a dozen issues, which at the time was a pretty significant storyline, especially considering it only ran through the main 2 Batman books. So it's a 6-month storyline to collect. That being Batman and Detective Comics, where Batman was alienated his allies, pushed himself to the physical and mental edge as he tried to bring control back to Gotham, only to be confronted by Bane, who viciously beat him before, in a classic wrestling move, as Bane himself had a mask that was clearly inspired by luchadors, takes Batman and shatters his spine across Bane's knee. Thus, he broke the bat. Bruce, assuming that he would never walk again because that's what medical doctors told him, and knowing that Dick has no desire to replace Batman and has other commitments outside of Gotham that would prevent him from giving Gotham the focus it would need of a bat, decides to appoint Jean-Paul Valley to replace him as Batman. And this is where Nightfall ends, with Bruce leaving Gotham, hoping to find some better treatment so he can at least walk, if not be Batman himself, as the defeat by Bane caused mental damage, at least to Bruce's fighting spirit, as well as the physical damage to his back. Now, that leads us into the Night Quest part of this arc. Now, Night Quest was actually more like 2 story arcs in one, because they split the main 2 titles. On the one end, you had what was referred to as Knights and the Crusade, which centered around Jean-Paul Valley and him being a new Batman. Now, the bad part about this is Jean-Paul was excessively violent towards crime, and did not see the point in fostering a relationship with the police and other heroes outside of Gotham like Bruce had always done. Jean-Paul wanted to do everything himself. Yeah, he'd occasionally work with Tim Drake as Robin, but basically, having been used to doing what he did as Azrael, where he would just go out in the field on his own and do what needed to be done to deal with this problem quick and with finality, he became a much more vicious Batman, who also was, and this is surprising to a lot of modern fans, a lot more antisocial. Meanwhile, in your other Batman book, you have Night Quest: The Search, which followed Bruce Wayne and his worldwide search to repair his mind, body, and soul, so he could at least be Bruce Wayne. Now, this all culminates with Bruce encountering a mystic-powered healer who sacrifices herself to restore Bruce Wayne's physical mobility and along with a few non-Gotham related dangers, reawakens Bruce's warrior spirit, thus giving him the two things he needed to be Batman. Just in time to hear messages from Tim and Dick that not only was Jean-Paul going way over the line and breaking the Batman's code about not killing and, not being a jerk to the police and the rest of the superhero community, but that he had also, in turn, driven off Alfred. So, this brings us to Knight's End. Now, whereas previously Knight's Fall had ran over several months, as had Knight's Quest, Knight's End was resolved in only 2 months, although at this point they did also involve the other Batman-related titles, this being Legends of the Dark Knight, the recently launched Robin series, and the Catwoman series. So even though it was done in less months, it still took, around the same number of issues to tell the story of Bruce's return to Gotham, confrontation of Jean-Paul, and his fight against Jean-Paul to reclaim the mantle of Batman. Now at this point you think, okay, we're all done, right? Trilogy of stories. But why did they suddenly at the end, after only using the main 2 Bat books, involve all these others? Well, it's very simple. By this point in time, it was the mid-90s, and DC Editorial was planning the 0 Hour company-wide crossover event. So, Dennis O'Neil wanted to wrap his story up before 0 Hour began, because he knew that the rest of the company would be expecting the classic Bruce Wayne Batman to be there for 0 Hour, and more importantly, the major worldwide events of 0 Hour would have overshadowed the conclusion of his saga. So what was the point of the whole saga then? I mean, over a few years, you saw the rise and fall of a replacement Batman. What's the point of doing that? You didn't really give the guy a run. Wasn't much of a fair chance, right? Especially when half the Batman books were still talking about Bruce Wayne. You didn't even really get rid of Bruce Wayne. At least during Funeral for a Friend and, Reign of the Superman, Clark Kent didn't show up till the big finale. Because he was dead. Well, it's very simple. Part of the inspiration for the idea was that, remember, in the early 90s, you had seen a big rise of the, quote, anti-hero. The more violent than ever, push things to the edge, extreme heroes. Dennis O'Neil was not fond of that. So, simple point is, the entire KnightSaga was one giant essay about why this new anti-hero edgy attitude wouldn't work for the Batman. Because the Batman legacy, yes, it's built off intimidation. Yes, it's built off a little bit of fear. But Batman himself has always been an honorable warrior who only does just enough violence to save the day. Which is why he keeps throwing his same handful of rogues gallery villains in Arkham over and over again. It would not be the Batman to actually try to execute any of them. Now, Azrael himself, following the KnightSaga, would get his own series, returning to his original identity and costume, in which he would seek out to go kind of back to his original idea of serving his holy order, but now as somebody who was kind of rooting out the more corrupt elements, having learned his lesson. Whew, sorry about that, folks. Dust and allergies happen. I promise that's all it is. But, as I was saying, Azrael would seek to learn his lessons from failing as the Bat and try to root out the more violent, corrupting elements from the Order so it could itself be more heroic. He would eventually, at the conclusion of his series, die in combat. Although in the years after that, DC would briefly attempt to have other people take on the mantle of Azrael. None of them were ever used outside of more than a couple arcs each. As for Batman himself, there was a series of immediately following story arcs, Prodigal and Troika, which dealt with Bruce having to rebuild both his reputation with the police, specifically Commissioner Gordon, who had felt that not being told that this was a different man under the Bat suit, and that the person appointed took the idea of Batman in a direction that not only didn't involve the police, but involved him doing things the police could not turn a blind eye to, as a sign of lack of trust from Batman when he had given so much trust and faith to Batman over the years. Bruce also had to rebuild his reputation within the superhero community, as most of them, not knowing who was under the cowl, were not told about this switch either, and thought basically Batman had been having a nervous breakdown and had gone over the line. Since a lot of them are themselves, despite being his fellow heroes, kind of intimidated by Batman to begin with, they really were frightened at the idea of Batman losing what little bit of honorable, heroic leashing he had to him. The immediate aftermath follow-ups would conclude with a one-shot Nightwing story wherein Nightwing would go to Europe to seek out and bring back Alfred Pennyworth, thus bringing the family together. This would lead to the last bit of status quo reaffirming, as for the first time in years, Batman truly appreciated how much he had needed a Bat family around him and began the process of communicating a lot more with Dick, appreciating Alfred and his role, as well as cementing his partnership with Tim and properly training Tim to be a hero in his own right. Which was great because Tim's solo Robin title would continue for many years after this. And the idea of the Batman books doing these Bat family crossover events would continue every few years throughout the 90s with other stories, the most famous of which being No Man's Land, in which Gotham was hit by a major earthquake and the city was in turn cordoned off, left to be one giant lawless zone, until eventually President Lex Luthor would, as part of his acts of PR manipulation and undermining the superhero community, restore order and physical stability to Gotham City. So did the story accomplish what it meant to? Basically, yeah. By the time Night's End was concluded, yeah, a few people that were kind of into the anti-hero thing were willing to follow Azrael's solo series, but even they had to agree he was no real Batman. He was a pale pretender. It did serve as a way for Dennis O'Neil, who had been the Batman editor for several years at this point, and had previously served as a writer for it before becoming the editor, a way to shake up the Batman status quo and his relationships with various people in and out of Gotham, while still remaining true to the spirit of what the Caped Crusader is. Essentially, spending a good 3 to 4 years, counting all the prologue build-up of Bruce's initial pushing people away, to get to a point that he hadn't been in since, the late 70s, early 80s. A Batman willing to lean on other people and accept that, yeah, he is human underneath the cowl and he does have emotions. He loves his family, even if it's not a traditional family. Him, his butler, his adopted son Dick, his protege Tim. These are all important relationships for Bruce Wayne that keep him grounded in humanity. And he had forgotten to appreciate those. And as such, when the threat of Bane came calling, Batman was not prepared to ask for the help he needed to deal with him. Now, of course, one of those immediate fallouts was a rematch with Bane, in which Batman would win because now he was at a physical and mental peak. Bane himself would occasionally seek out further matches with Batman, but would also interact with various other members of the DC universe, including serving for a time on the villain-based mercenary team, the Secret Six, in which he would find that his strict "the world is one giant prison and the toughest man is the one sitting on top of the throne" mindset would work well within the team's dynamics, as well as opening up Bane's own emotional centers. As within the Secret Six comic, he did find himself a girlfriend eventually. Is it a good storyline? By and large. Some of the Knight's Quest stuff in the middle is awkward because, as I said, you're basically got two stories running at once. in which you got a Bruce Wayne that doesn't really feel much like Bruce Wayne because he's been broken. It is interesting to see him rebuilding himself mentally and spiritually, but the whole physical thing with the Mystic Healer, it kind of felt like almost a Deus Ex Machina solution. It's like, oh, we created this character just to have an excuse to restore what should have been a lifelong paralysis. Yeah, it's sad. In a way that, because it was always planned to have a very finite length, that honestly Bruce spent as little time as he did broken. On the other hand, Jean-Paul, as I said, was written and designed to always fail as the Bat. Now, yes, I do agree with Dennis O'Neil that there was a lot of stuff going on in the 90s that was pushing things a little too far if you still want to call yourself hero. The idea of basically creating somebody who served as such a perfect archetype of the current gen of young, extra vicious good guys, to the point that he was essentially satirical, it's kind of awkward. I hate to say it, because again, the man's dead, he can't defend himself, and I respect basically every other thing Dennis O'Neil did as an editor, and a lot of what he did as a writer. I hate to say it, but came off kind of petty and passive aggressive. I get you didn't like the ideals, but there was a customer base for it. So writing this huge storyline to basically say, yeah, I guess they're kind of cool, but it's not like any of them could ever hang with the Batman. None of them could ever be what Batman is. Comes off snarky. But maybe that's just me. So, I hope you've enjoyed this Friday rambling. If the storyline does sound intriguing for you, if you're somebody that has enjoyed seeing Bane in the movies and wants to read the storyline that has most defined him and set him up as a man that you must always be very cautious of, go hunt down the collections of them. Hunt down your trades. If you're a big Batman fan, by all means, the KnightSaga is a huge turning point in the history of Batman. So if you're a Batman fan, go seek these issues out. You should not be disappointed in the story. If you're just a general comic book fan, these probably aren't the most definitive Batman stories. So I wouldn't seek them out if you're new to the Batman mythos. But don't be afraid to encounter them eventually, if you continue digging into all things Batman. For now, though, I am going to say goodbye, and hope to see you in 7 days. 7. So many fingers. 7 of them. As we discuss the second time that DC Comics decided to really look at what it meant to be the Bat and what it means to Bruce Wayne to be the Bat. So, I hope you join us. It'll be a bit of a trippy ride, but it'll be fun chat. So, be good to each other. Don't be too much of a hater. And if you can't wait 7 days, remember, Roulette Productions has a variety of shows for you to occupy yourself during the week. The brand new Generation eXpletive, and I myself return off screen narrating fun retro video games in Bardic plays. So, join us Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. and maybe even some extra days if we find some bonus content to squeeze out there. You have to subscribe so you don't miss out. See you in 7, if not sooner, folks. Bye-bye.